Welcome to this discussion today about cloud apps adoption and the overlap with cybersecurity. With me here today, I've got Lee Nolan, the CTO at MTI Technology, and I've got Francois Lasnier, SVP of IAM at Gemalto. So thanks, guys, for your time today. So to kick off, maybe it'd be great, Lee, if you could explain, the rise of cloud apps adoption and where that leaves the enterprise at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's a wider play in the market because everyone's seen public cloud. It's not new anymore. It's old, but with the rise of cloud applications as part of that, organisations find that there's more agility. Actually, a lot of the models in the market, they're making that software available only through cloud apps. So as a result, organisations have to adopt in that way. Because of cloud apps, then security comes into play as well. How do you cover those areas? How do you make sure that the policies and processes you have in place from a legacy environment can now reach out to provide protection on those cloud applications? So it's imperative to understand how you secure them, what technology you use, and also what processes you apply, how you manage that in the right way to make sure that protection's there as well. So it's ensuring that scalability, flexibility of any solutions that you have in place and the processes in which you manage security around cloud apps.
Gemalto research has found that organizations usually have about 27 different cloud apps at any one time. So, maybe, Francois, you could explain, what apps are these? What apps are we talking about here? And, how important are they to the enterprise?
Yeah, if we look at some of the metrics, and the ranking in the what we call software as a service, Office 365 from Microsoft, is probably at the top of that list, right? I saw at least some numbers like 87% of organizations are using Office 365 or are planning to do it in the next 12 months. But then you have, Salesforce.com that is very prevalent as well. You have, Workday, you have Concur. A lot of applications are becoming now mission critical for a lot of businesses. Yeah.
Okay. And so from the security perspective then, there's loads of different challenges that businesses have to meet. Perhaps we can go through them because there seems to be kind of different types of challenges that they're faced with. Firstly, if we could look at end users, what is the end user challenge?
So from an end user perspective, the challenge around security is the element of, if I take an approach around zero trust, how an end user may be uncomfortable or unhappy about their experience. They feel that they are restricted in their access, the areas they want to go through, that's time consuming. If things aren't set up in the right way, you could be in a situation where you're authenticating too often. And it's been shown that actually innovation could be stifled with the incorrect deployment of security solutions for an end user. So for an end user environment, the organization as a whole actually struggles and suffers because innovation is stifled, as I say. So end users understand that security is important. They understand that they need to make sure that the organization is protected. But at the same time, there is a balance that says, how do I ensure that I still allow innovation within my business? That users can be highly productive even in a highly secure environment. So from an end user, that's where the challenge comes into play, and I'm sure there are many people that have had their own experiences where it's just been so suffocating, where the security overlay hasn't really taken into account business agility.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, as well as that, there's obviously the IT challenges, probably the same as many other IT projects and initiatives. What are they?
Yeah, I think that the main IT challenge, is how do you protect, the new perimeter, right? The virtual perimeter that the cloud now is introducing, in the landscape. To a certain extent, by the way, it's kind of ironic because a lot of organizations, 20 years ago had started to address, the user challenge, of creating single sign-on within the enterprise perimeter, removing, password to a certain extent and creating, user convenience in accessing all the enterprise applications. But the introduction of cloud and the adoption of cloud applications have kind of reset the clock completely, right? Because all of a sudden now enterprise, IT resources had to build new security policies around these cloud applications, and it started also completely to impact also the user experience, because most of the cloud applications today are protected by username and password again, and each of these cloud applications have different password policies, and they are managed in silos as well, right? So for IT staff, it creates a very, very big challenge, because they are going back now to managing password complexity and password fatigue and different password policies. So the main challenge is, how do you bring order into that new chaos, right? At the same time, how do you put the security policies that you had built for your internal resources now onto these new applications that you do not control? I mean, there's no security perimeter that you can control around these cloud applications. And at the same time, in addition to the cloud adoption, the fact that now you're allowing users also to connect to these applications from anywhere, from any device, is adding, on top of the fact that there is cloud adoption, it's adding also a lot of complexity for IT resources to do that securely. Yeah.
Okay, and obviously then the person who plays a big part in all of this is the CISO, in making sure everything is secure and looking at the risk management perspective. So how does the risk management perspective, Lee, fit into everything that Francois was saying?
Yeah, exactly as Francois was saying, it's almost resetting the clock to say, okay, we need to review our position again and understand how we protect authentication. The username and password comes into play. You find a lot of users actually end up putting in their personal username and passwords, and then they apply those to the corporate accounts, and that comes with its own challenges. From a risk management perspective, again, it's all of risk management is generally around protecting data, right? So understanding personal profiles, making sure that there aren't those breaches, and authentication is a fundamental part of that. If you've got someone's own personal profile, their digital identity, that needs to be protected, whichever device, whichever application, in whichever way it's being accessed, that needs to be protected. And you need to understand profiles of those users as well. So risk management is applied to what users have I got, what data are they accessing, how are they accessing it, and then how do I apply the right security controls and authentication levels against those particular users, and if I'm ensuring that I understand the type of data that's being accessed, what is the risk profile against that data? Now, only when you do that work up front, from a CISO perspective, can you then apply the right solutions around your organization. And then it's really ensuring that that's managed effectively ongoing. So a CISO really, it's the study and piece of work up front is users, profiles, and data access. Once you've got that in place, you can then start looking at solutions from that point of view.
And I suppose they've got an interesting role, though, of balancing what their needs along with the two other challenges we mentioned there. So the CIO's perspective and the end user perspective. How does everyone go about working together to make sure that it's a solution that fits?
And I think that's a very good question, because for a long time, authentication was addressed or as kind of a silo function, right? Because it was really trying to protect, I would say, the access, of very specific use case. Typically, was remote access users coming, from outside into the enterprise perimeter, right? As long as now enterprise start to understand that they cannot build, a perimeter around all their applications or data, especially now that data is located anywhere. As long as they realize that typical network level security, mechanisms are not enough, and that I would say a comprehensive, access management policy across all the enterprise resources rely on identity-aware solutions. I think that's where the concept of access management platform and access management framework come into play, because all of a sudden you're in the solution itself, you're taking into account different level of dimensions, right? You're taking into account users, so depending on which group the user belong to and what is the risk profile of the user, you can set up different type of policies. The second dimension is obviously the sensitivity of the assets that the user is trying to access, right? Whether it's specific data in a database or an application residing in the cloud or in the enterprise. And the third dimension is the risk as well, based on the context. Because as I mentioned, adopting cloud applications is not the only challenge that the digital transformation is creating for enterprise customers. The accessing applications from anywhere is an additional challenge. And being able now to take into account, which device that the user is trying to use now to access this sensitive application is very important, because enterprise also have to adapt to the change of user behavior and change of expectations from end users, right? The way that the people work today and conduct, their workday for office type applications has completely changed, over the last few years. And the expectations from end users are very different. They want to be able to work from a plane. They want to be able to work, from their home PC and or their tablet. So the new application access management frameworks that are coming into play are really taking into account, these three dimensions, right? The users, the type of applications or data that the users are trying to access, and the context of the transaction itself, and allowing then CISOs and IT officers to be able to put security policies that take into account these three dimensions to really improve the user convenience, allow efficiency in the organizations, while at the same time preserve, the security policies of the company that are quite important. Yeah.
And Lee, I suppose everything there that Francois was saying it leads to explain why cloud apps are perhaps more vulnerable to a data breach if you don't secure them, because you're using them everywhere on different devices. Does that explain it?
Yeah, when it comes to breaches or targeting, it's always going to be what's deemed to be the easiest route, right? Whether it's phishing or going via the software as a service cloud apps and driving that. Now, the soft underbelly around using software as a service is fundamentally the authentication. And just playing back to your question around a CIO, I think whether it's a CISO or a CIO, clearly a CISO, is compliance. Everyone understands the need for compliance. Everyone goes through that on a daily basis, whether it's PCI, whether it's CES, whether it's ISO 27001, etc. Everyone understands the need for that it's an everyday occurrence inside organizations, and businesses accept that. And I think the CIO accepts that as well. Really, it's about deploying something that is exactly right in context and the data sources, but it gives the flexibility. So things like, okay, well, can I apply a smart card to allow me to authenticate again? Can I have a one-time passcode? A lot of people would have experienced that on banking, etc., but applied in the corporate workspace and have one-time passwords sent through, and things like out-of-band protection as well. A lot of businesses can, when connected, feel that there's security there, but when something is out of band, how do you connect the profile of that user? How do you authenticate in the right way if someone is actually out of band? So that becomes important as well. If you apply those, then actually, there are areas where the attacks will come in where they deem it to be easier to gain a breach. But actually, if you're applying the right level of authentication, then you will be covered. And exactly as we're talking about, it's ensuring that reach out from what is a central environment that was easier to understand how users were connecting back into the core, now is to accessing from anywhere to anywhere. You still need to make sure that corporate information, corporate data, personal information is all protected. And of course, credentials are the key area of which organizations look to be exploited. Then authentication is the key area to make sure you're protected in that way.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add actually on that point. I mean, that's very very valid, and there's something that people that we talk to, customers don't sometimes understand and realize. For instance, if you wanted to attack, or breach an email server of an organization, right? In the old days, you had to go and penetrate the perimeter of that company, so breach the VPN or try to attack, through a network type attack. Then you had to go and find, where the mail server in the organization was residing, and then try to breach into that mail server. Now, with the number I mentioned earlier of 87% adoption of Office 365, right? There's one entry gate in the cloud for all the customers, right? If you type outlook.office365.com, that's the entry gate of the mail server now of millions of end users and organizations, right? So meaning that through social attacks and knowing that a lot of people and a lot of organizations still rely on username and password for people to check their email, if you get a big database of username and password from the attack of a social media company, there's a high chance that a lot of these passwords will open also emails of these users using their corporate email address, right? And the fact that there's one entry gate that is a public entry gate is a big vulnerability point, right? And the fact that a lot of organizations today have adopted Office 365 and still rely on username and password to protect the entry to the email is definitely a very, very high security concern. And that's why I think that as part of the cloud migration, companies need to seriously reconsider the type of security policies that they want to allow and the type of identity-based access management platform that they need to put in place, because clearly there is, now a very high vulnerability and a lot of risk involved in cloud adoption if it is not done properly, right?
Yeah. So we've spoken a lot about context when it comes to securing cloud apps. How about contextual and adaptive authentication? How does that play a role in all of this?
So I would say, it has adaptive has two main benefits, right? Adaptive authentication. One is benefit to end users, because the whole concept of adaptive authentication is to remove as much as possible the friction in terms of re-authenticating the user if the risk profile is low, right? I mean, if the user, for instance, is logging from the company-approved PC from the enterprise domain, so we know that the user is within the enterprise and is trying to access from an approved company PC, the risk is low. Why do we need to re-authenticate the user, for instance, in this special circumstance, right? On the other hand, if that same user steps outside the office, is traveling, eventually to a country that is considered, high risk profile and is trying to connect to the same resource based on a tablet, for instance, which is not a company-approved access point, then the risk profile is much higher, and the ability then to trigger, authentication only for these specific instances that require it from a risk profile, improve user convenience overall, right? Because you zoom in then on the high-risk transactions and you authenticate only when absolutely needed. So I think the concept of adaptive authentication is to be able to really improve, user convenience by removing as much as possible the friction when authentication is not necessary. But at the same time, it allows company to set up policies, especially now that user behaviors and user expectations are different. It allows company to set up policies allowing, BYOD, right? So bring your own device and so on, but taking into account the context. And then there are additional use cases that we are starting to see emerge as well. For instance, if you want to geo-restrict access to resources, for instance, right? I mean, GDPR is a new regulation, in Europe for data privacy and data protection. So we've seen use case in customer service, for instance, where you want to segregate, your database, for instance, and say if you have a customer support resource that is trying to access the database and if that resource is physically located in Europe, then you can set, some access conditions as part of the adaptive authentication to allow, the access if that user is in the right location. On the other hand, if that user is not in the right location, you can deny access to these resources, right? So you can start actually also improve compliance by taking advantage, I would say, of adaptive authentication and flexible access policies. Yeah.
Just as an add-in to that, as an extension, what we're seeing in businesses is, as well as the authentication, is behavioral analytics. So understanding users in a particular group, the patterns of what they access, where they access it, what time they access it. And actually, if users are suddenly, or a user is going outside of their normal behavior of what they access, what time it is on device and where it is geographically, then actually risk scores are thrown up, and that can provide alerts into the business as well. So as with all these things, security is made up of layers inside a business. So when you get into the adaptive authentication, it's very important, but at the same time, the user behavior analytics will assess if there is any credential issue potentially, and then credit risk scores can be provided as well, to understand if users are behaving in the wrong way. So I think that becomes important as well. I don't think there's ever a position where you would say that one layer of security is going to cover you, whether it's just perimeter, just authentication. There needs to be those layers, and things like behavior analytics add to that as well.
Yeah. A lot of customers might be asking, why do I need privileged access management as well as a kind of identity and authentication and access management solution?
Well, I mean, the simple answer to that question is the fact that privileged access management solutions, are meant typically for a specific category of users, which are, IT administrator mostly, and the resources and the assets that are, under the scope of PAM solutions are very, very, specific, right? They are IT resources that typically do not support, standard-based authentication. And they are, database, Unix servers, and so on and so forth. And there is a component also in terms of auditing everything that is being done by the IT admin on these resources as well, right? So the scope, I would say, of the target resources that the PAM solution is trying to protect is limited to very specific assets. Whereas, an access management solution is much broader in scope, right? I mean, we are trying to protect a lot of variety of resources, whether they are internal application, external application, and with a very wide number of users as well, which can be, by the way, internal users, enterprise employees, as well as external users, right? Contractors and sometimes consumers as well that are trying to connect from outside and access, enterprise resource. So it's fundamentally very, very different, in scope. But on the other hand, what's clear is that there are some technical principles, in access management solution, especially the adaptive authentication that we just talked about, that can be very relevant in the context of PAM as well. So that's why we've done a lot of effort, to make sure that our solution integrates very well with privileged access management solution, because introducing the concept, of adaptive authentication for privileged users is a big benefit, because especially with this type of resources, that's where you want eventually to say, if that IT admin, is trying to access that database inside the enterprise perimeter, then maybe, it's enough to do an Active Directory authentication, right, based on username and password. On the other hand, if that resource is trying to access, that critical asset from outside the enterprise, we want a smart card type PKI authentication, right? Very strong, high-level authentication. So the two solutions can definitely coexist, and their scope is very different. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that as well, on the PAM side, it's not only IT admins, it's machine access as well. More and more, as we see through automation, machines are having privileged access. So the ability to protect those machines, because they've got those access points, becomes critical as well. You need to have the same policies and procedures around those, almost as you would do any user with the PAM coverage as well. So just to make that additional point to what Francois was talking around is machines as well, and that will become more and more prevalent as we go through with things like RPA and processes that are automated, as well as IT ops being automated as well. It's making sure that those accounts are covered too.
So what are the next steps that an organization can take in terms of protecting cloud access?
Well, I think there are, clearly, solutions that they can implement, very rapidly, and something we are trying to educate, our customers about. Many of the customers already have authentication solutions, but typically to protect, remote users, so for remote access, a very narrow use case. And what many of these customers don't realize is that they can easily expand, from that existing deployment to extend the application or the resources to protect, to protect also access to cloud resources, right? So that's a framework that we've been working on to really allow customers that are already protecting remote access to now protect the access to cloud applications, easily taking advantage, the adaptive authentication to remove user friction. So So that exists. In terms of the mindset of customers and how they should approach, the whole problematic of adopting cloud applications and putting the right security perimeter, I think we touched a little bit on it, earlier. What we recommend is really do an assessment, I would say, of all the critical resources, critical data that the company is trying to protect. Because in the end, when we talk about cloud applications, it's very different. If you are using a travel management or a travel agency type application, or you're using ServiceNow, Workday, for ERP type needs, right? The assets have different risk profiles. So doing a proper assessment of the applications, putting the risk profile in front of all these applications, and then deciding as a company what are also the user scenarios that you want to allow. So how do you want to allow your users, whether they are internal or external, to access these applications in different circumstances? And what we provide with Gemalto, with our access management platform, is then the ability to translate these risk profile and user scenarios into actual enforcement policies, leveraging the access management platform. And these solutions are not a pipe dream, right? They are existing today. Yeah.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think one of the biggest areas is not only carrying out that assessment, but it's also the extracting the value. And I don't think this is purely to IAM. I think it's an awful lot of the security solutions that we see deployed is ensuring that you extract the value of that solution over time. What we see is the assessment being done, the deployment being put in place, and fairly rapidly a degradation of the process that's applied, which means that the value extracted from the solution investment is not being taken on by the business, and it slowly falls away. So the not only do you not see the financial return on that, but the security levels aren't what they should be. You start getting end user implications on not being able to access what they should do, or people being able to access far more than they should do, because it's not being looked after in the right way. Organizations sometimes don't have the right specialisms in-house or can't retain the right specialists. At MTI, we deliver managed services for these solutions just to make sure that organizations can not only deploy the solutions up front, but they're managed correctly over time, because it's not only about the technology, it's about the people and process. So we integrate well with those customers to make sure that we manage it and extract that value. And that's, for me, that's a really critical point. We see it way too often in making sure that that value is extracted over time. And that's where MTI bring our managed services to bear to ensure customers do realize that value.
Okay, great. Well, it's clear that with the combination of things here, there's a rise in kind of how critical the data is that's being stored in cloud apps. There's a rise in cloud apps being used, and there's also a rise in data breaches. So clearly, with all these three things combined, there's an importance for IAM and a varied use of different types of security solutions to protect the enterprise. So thanks a lot, Lee and Francois, for your time today. I think it was a really interesting discussion, and until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.